Dutch stands on a frozen mountainside, revolver in hand, coat whipping in the wind. Arthur is bleeding, John is exhausted. The snow is stained with the last hopes of a dying gang. The Pinkertons are closing in below, civilization itself crawling up the cliffs with rifles and warrants. It feels like the end of a legend. In truth, it is the echo of something that once happened in blood, not pixels. Because this is not just a game story. It is a modern myth, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and torn apart by greed. In the truest sense, the van der Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of an American moment, a brief, violent season, when the world was changing faster than men with guns could ride. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s to its violent end in the early 1900s, this gang mirrors the real outlaw boom that followed the Civil War. Railroads cut across open country, telegraphs stitched distant towns together, federal law and private detectives hunted men who had once disappeared into the horizon. The old ways were dying, and those who refused to bend were pushed toward one of two fates, a shallow grave or a gallows watched by reporters. Dutch, Arthur, John, Sadie, Micah, even the Pinkertons that haunt them, do not emerge from nowhere. They stand on the shoulders of men and women with names that once filled wanted posters and dime novels. Dutch borrows from philosopher outlaws and notorious Dutch gunmen, part preacher, part robber. Arthur carries the weight of loyal enforcers like Frank James and Bill Doolin, the steady right hand who believes in the cause long after the cause stops believing in him. John Marston rides in the shadow of Butch Cassidy and the last generation of gunslingers, trapped between the saddle and the railroad timetable. Even the traitor in their midst, Micah Bell, has real-world cousins, informants who sold out their partners to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, men whose silver tongues were deadlier than their pistols. Sadie Adler channels the rage and skill of women such as Belle Starr and sharpshooters who stepped into a man's world with a rifle and refused to step back. Each character is an archetype sharpened by history, not a fantasy conjured from nothing. This is a story of America as much as it is a story of outlaws. From the first laugh between Dutch and Hosea, two conmen trying to rob each other on a dusty road, to the last bullets on that frozen mountain, the van der Linde saga traces the country's violent transition between freedom and civilization, between idealistic rhetoric and brutal reality. What happens when a gang built on a philosophy of resistance collides with railroads, telegraphs, the Dawes Act, and a government determined to fence every horizon? This video will follow that entire arc, from the very beginning of the gang's dream to its bitter end, tying each campfire, each heist, each betrayal to the real outlaws and events that inspired it. By the time the smoke clears, every name in the gang will point back to someone who once rode under a real western sun. This is, in the truest sense, the complete story of the van der Linde gang's lore and its real-world shadows. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a found family trying to outrun a civilization that has already marked their graves. The promise is simple, even if the history is not. From its humble beginnings to its final, smoking ruins, this saga will follow Dutch's gang from the first con pulled with Hosea in the 1870s to the last gunshots that echo through Red Dead Redemption. Along the way, each chapter in their rise and fall will be held up against the real outlaws and lawmen who rode those trails first, Frank James and Bill Doolin as blueprints for loyal enforcers, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as the last generation of romanticized train robbers, Belle Starr and other women who refused to stay in the background, and the Pinkerton National Detective Agency as the relentless, corporate face of modern law. The structure is a chronological saga, but not a dry timeline. Each camp, each heist, each argument around the fire becomes a marker on a road that runs parallel to actual Western history. When the gang robs trains, the story will pause with the James Younger gang and the Doolin Dalton boys, who turned railroads into rolling banks. When Pinkertons close in on Dutch, the narrative will shift to the real manhunts, where agents hunted Jesse James, the Wild Bunch, and union organizers with the same cold efficiency. The starting point is not Arthur Morgan in 1899, not John Marston standing alone against the world, but two clever young grifters in the 1870s. Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews, both trying to rob each other in a dingy room, realizing in a moment of amused recognition that together they could rob the whole world. That partnership becomes the gang's ideological backbone. Dutch the philosopher outlaw, half Dutch Henry Bourne and half dime novel preacher, Hosea the weary realist who knows the game always ends the same way. From that first shared scheme, the gang grows into the living embodiment of Dutch's belief in freedom over order, family over institutions. The ending lies in the early 1900s, when the old ways were dying. Railroads knit the continent together, telegraphs outran horses, the Dawes Act carved tribal lands into pieces, and federal law reached into every canyon. The final bullets that end the gang's story, from Micah's treacherous standoff to John's last day at Beecher's Hope, will be traced alongside the real last stands of men like Cassidy, Sundance, and other lost soul gunmen who discovered the frontier had no place for them. Across this journey, abstract themes become concrete. Freedom turns into specific robberies and broken oaths. Myth-making becomes newspaper headlines and dime novels twisting bloody shootouts into legend. Each major member of the gang will be paired with a historical mirror, until by the end, every face around Dutch's campfire points back to a real, breathing outlaw who once believed the world could not catch up. And so the next step is simple: return to that first meeting. That first almost botched robbery between Dutch and Hosea, and watch the spark that will one day burn an era to the ground. The story does not begin with a gunfight. It begins with a joke that almost gets two men killed. On a cold stretch of road in the 1870s, a young Dutch van der Linde rode out hunting for opportunity and found what he thought was an easy mark: an older traveler, alone, with a wagon and the relaxed air of a man who trusted the open world a little too much. Dutch eased in with charm, with that easy, educated drawl, spinning a story of hardship and misfortune, ready to steer the conversation toward a purse and a pistol. The traveler was Hosea Matthews, and Hosea was working the exact same con. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang is a story of mirrors, and this was the very beginning. Dutch tried to play the desperate victim, Hosea, the sympathetic stranger. Then, in a heartbeat, the roles flipped. Dutch's hand drifted toward his revolver. Hosea's eyes narrowed. Both men realized, almost in the same breath, that the other was lying, that the script had been turned on them by someone who knew every line. For a second it could have gone to blood. Dutch, the charismatic outlaw philosopher, had a temper that could flare as fast as his tongue could move. He was educated, proud, convinced that the world was changing and that only the clever would stay free. Hosea, older and wrier, had spent decades reading men, picking apart weakness, preferring brains over bullets because brains rarely missed. Two predators, circling, two pistols, half drawn. Then they laughed. The tension snapped not with gunfire, but with shared amusement at how perfectly they had almost killed their own reflections. That laughter was the first real bond, a recognition that each had found an equal, a partner who could see the angles, tell a story, sell a dream. In the truest sense, it was the first moment of loyalty between them, born not of fear, but of mutual respect for each other's intelligence. From that day, Dutch became the voice and vision, the living embodiment of an idealistic philosophy about freedom and civilization, while Hosea became the quiet strategist in the background, the man who made sure those dreams did not collapse under their own weight. It echoed famous outlaw duos of the age, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, with Cassidy's schemes and Sundance's gun. Jesse and Frank James, one the legend, the other the calculating hand behind it. Dutch and Hosea stepped into that pattern, one radiating charisma, the other anchoring it with hard-earned caution. Their partnership was not born from pure brutality. It was born from charm, wit, and a shared belief that the old ways were dying and that men like them could slip through the cracks of a corrupt civilization. For a time, their crimes aimed upward, at railroads and banks and the rich who profited from a rigged system. It felt less like banditry and more like rebellion, at least to them. But how long can a dream built on deception hold its shape once more lost souls start gathering around their campfire? For a while, the dream held. Around Dutch and Hosea, that first version of the van der Linde gang took shape, not as an army of killers, but as a traveling theater of deception, a story of two men trying to stay one step ahead of a world closing in. Their early years were defined less by gunfire than by performance. Dutch would charm his way onto a stagecoach, all smiles and easy conversation, while Hosea rode ahead to arrange a fake breakdown, a washed-out bridge, or a sudden road repair that forced the coach to stop. Passengers were relieved of their jewelry and cash, but rarely their lives. Dutch preferred a clever ruse to a corpse on the ground, and Hosea understood that dead men brought pauses, while embarrassed rich men often stayed quiet. In the truest sense, they were conmen first and outlaws second. They ran non-lethal bank swindles, bogus investment schemes, and elaborate insurance tricks that mirrored the real-world grifts of the era. From confidence men in frontier towns to the softer edges of the James Younger gang before it hardened. Many infamous outfits began this way, from its humble beginnings as loose circles of relatives and drinking partners, to more disciplined bands of raiders once blood had been spilled. Dutch and Hosea were walking that same path, even if they did not yet see where it led. As the money improved, so did the size of their orbit. Dutch's charisma pulled in drifters, runaways, and every lost soul who heard his speeches about freedom and family around the campfire. He was the living embodiment of the romantic outlaw, quoting books half-remembered, railing against railroads and bankers, promising that civilization was a cage built for lesser men. While Dutch preached, Hosea quietly did the work that kept them alive. He chose campsites with escape routes, arranged safe houses and fences, counted ammunition and food, and made sure someone was always watching the horizon. Here, the first outlines of a code emerged. Dutch insisted they only robbed the rich and powerful, never the poor farmers who reminded him of his own father. He framed every heist as a blow against a rigged system, a philosophy that echoed the way newspapers once tried to paint Jesse James as a folk hero, striking back at railroads. Hosea believed in some of that, but he also believed in staying breathing, and he spent years tempering Dutch's more reckless impulses. When Dutch wanted to hit a well-guarded express, Hosea steered him toward a softer target. When Dutch talked about burning a town to send a message, Hosea talked him down to a single safe. Then, something shifted. Their success, their growing reputation, and the whispers that followed them through saloons began to draw in younger, more impressionable recruits. Boys who had read dime novels about Butch Cassidy and the last great gangs saw Dutch not just as a leader, but as a father, a prophet, a man who promised that the old ways were dying, yet could somehow be reclaimed through sheer will. That romanticized image was powerful. It was also dangerous. Because what happens when impressionable hearts fall in love with the legend, but never learn the caution that built it? For Dutch van der Linde, that legend was never just decoration. It was a philosophy, a banner under which he could gather the broken and the angry, and convince them that their crimes were not crimes at all, but a story of resistance in a world that had left them behind. From the very beginning, Dutch spoke in terms that sounded almost noble. He promised freedom from government control, from railroads and bankers and men in suits who carved up the land with pens instead of guns. The gang, in his words, was family in the truest sense, chosen rather than inherited, bound by loyalty instead of law. Robbing a train, holding up a stagecoach, emptying the safe of a corrupt magnate became, under Dutch's rhetoric, an act of rough justice. Take from the rich and the rotten, give to those the system had ground into the mud. Who would not want to believe that? Dutch fed that belief with books. He carried tattered volumes of philosophy and revolution, quoted lines half-remembered from European radicals and American transcendentalists, and turned campfires into lecture halls. He loved speeches, loved standing at the center of the circle, voice rising as he painted a world where the old ways were dying, yet a small band of outlaws could hold back civilization's march through sheer conviction. In those moments, he was the living embodiment of the romantic bandit from dime novels, the philosopher outlaw whose gun and tongue were equally sharp. But beneath the poetry, contradictions waited. Dutch preached restraint until he felt cornered, then reached for violence with terrifying speed. He talked about collective decision-making, yet every plan had to run through him. Every victory had to bear his name. When a robbery went wrong, it was the world's fault, the government's fault, the Pinkerton's fault, never the man whose ego demanded spectacle. Any action, no matter how brutal, could be wrapped in the language of the dream and sent marching into the night. In this, Dutch echoed several real figures. Dutch Henry Bourne, a horse thief with a reputation larger than his actual exploits. Dutch Schultz, a later-era gangster who cloaked greed and grandstanding. Charismatic leaders from bands like Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, who posed for studio photographs and read their own press, carefully curating an image of charming rogues rather than desperate criminals. Dutch van der Linde is a composite of these men, their ideals and delusions stitched into one magnetic outlaw king. That magnetism mattered. Around him gathered every lost soul who had been failed by the state, the law, or polite society. Orphans, widows, drifters, men and women pushed to the margins by race, class, or simple bad luck heard in Dutch's speeches a promise of dignity and belonging. He told them they were not misfits, but pioneers of a different kind of freedom. And for a time, that promise held. The tragedy begins when promises meet reality. Because what happens when the idealistic philosophy that built a family runs headfirst into hunger, grief, and the noose tightening around the frontier? For the van der Linde gang, the first line of defense against that collision between promises and reality was not a gunman or a dynamite expert. It was Hosea Matthews, a tired-eyed swindler who understood that the world was changing long before Dutch ever admitted it. From the very beginning, Hosea is a story of quiet control. Where Dutch loved speeches and spectacle, Hosea loved angles and exits. He had spent a lifetime running cons across the frontier, preferring forged bonds, fake identities, and elaborate social engineering over shootouts in the street. The Rhodes tobacco scam, the Valentine auctioneer ruse, the endless stream of fake bonds, stagecoach tips, and rigged poker games. Hosea is the living embodiment of the gang's brains over bullets approach. Dutch might sell the philosophy. Hosea makes sure the plan actually works. That difference defines their partnership. Dutch dreams big, talks big, and increasingly wants to steal big. Hosea, limping with age and experience, keeps pushing in the opposite direction. Smaller robberies, safer scores, fast getaways. When Dutch talks about one last grand score that will buy freedom from civilization, Hosea counters with farms, investments, and the quiet life Bessie once tried to give him. He questions the Saint Denis bank idea. He doubts the Tahiti fantasy. He warns that the old ways were dying and that the gang's window was closing. Dutch wants legend. Hosea wants survival. Yet, Hosea is no saint. In the truest sense, he is a career outlaw, perfectly willing to lie, cheat, and ruin a mark's savings if it keeps the camp fed. But he has lines. He dislikes needless killing, especially when a con can end with humiliation instead of blood. He bristles when children are drawn into danger, whether it is Jack Marston's kidnapping or the gang hiding in houses where families might be caught in the crossfire. His morality is not clean, but it is real, and it makes his eventual fate hit harder. What happens to a conscience when no one listens anymore? Historically, Hosea's role echoes men such as Bill Doolin or the older lieutenants who shadowed figures like Jesse James and Butch Cassidy. These were the planners and stabilizers, the ones who knew train schedules, bank routines, and the temper of their own hot-headed leaders. Their caution often delayed disaster for years, stretching an outlaw career far beyond what raw violence could sustain. Hosea stands in that tradition, from its humble beginnings in petty swindles to grand cons against railroads and industrialists. But time wears down even the steadiest hand. As Pinkertons tighten their net and Dutch's ego swells under pressure, Hosea's influence begins to slip. His voice of doubt is talked over, his calls for moderation dismissed as cowardice, his friendship quietly replaced by Micah's flattery and brutality. The gang's conscience is still present, still warning, still planning, yet each new camp finds Dutch listening a little less. That erosion will make the next decisions, and the next disasters, far more catastrophic than any of them can yet imagine. Yet for all that erosion, there was a time when the van der Linde gang almost lived up to its own legend. Before Blackwater, before Saint Denis, before the betrayals, camp life could feel less like a criminal enterprise and more like a wandering village trying to outrun civilization. The story does not begin with gunfire here, but with coffee pots and stew kettles. In the early days, wherever the gang hammered in stakes and raised canvas, a routine emerged. Pearson grumbling over the stew, Grimshaw barking orders, guitars coming out as the sun went down, shared meals around a single fire, songs from half a dozen homelands, stories traded by people who had nowhere else to go. It was, from its humble beginnings, a family assembled from the unwanted and the wounded. Dutch framed that firelight as something more than comfort. In his speeches, the gang was a social experiment in the truest sense, the living embodiment of his philosophy that freedom came not from laws, but from loyalty. Governments lied, railroads stole, banks bled farmers dry. The gang, he insisted, did the opposite. They protected their own, shared what they took, and struck only at those who deserved it. Was it robbery or was it righteous redistribution? Around those flames, the answer could seem obvious. Money from a train job became medicine for Tilly, ammunition for Bill, blankets for Jack. Dutch and Hosea held court, explaining that their crimes were a protest against a rigged world, a story of resistance in an age when the old ways were dying and the world was changing too fast for honest men to keep up. To a lost soul drifting through that camp, the choice between lonely poverty and outlaw family hardly felt like a choice at all. Yet even in its most idealistic phase, the code that held them together was flexible, not pure. They tried to avoid unnecessary civilian bloodshed, made a point of helping a rancher here or a widow there when it suited them, and prided themselves on not being mindless killers. At the same time, every sack of flour, every rifle cartridge, every bottle passed around the fire had been paid for with someone else's labor. Their freedom depended on other people's fear. This tension linked them to real outlaw families that haunted the West. The James Younger gang robbed banks they claimed were strangling farmers, bound together by kinship and Confederate grievance. The Wild Bunch rode with a camaraderie that made their camps feel closer to carnivals than conspiracies, convincing themselves they were more honorable than the corporations and railroads they held up. Dutch's crew echoed those legends, borrowing their pride and their blind spots. From the very beginning, then, the Van der Linde camp was both refuge and contradiction, a utopian dream built on stolen coin, held together by Dutch's charisma and a fragile belief that they were different. But what happens when the man at the center starts needing the dream more than the truth? The answer will turn that warm circle of firelight into something far darker. For Dutch's dream to feel real, it needed more than speeches and stolen coin. It needed a disciple, a living embodiment of his philosophy, breathing proof that an outlaw could be both ruthless and righteous in a world that refused to make room for men like him. That proof arrived in the shape of a boy who had already given up on civilization long before civilization gave up on him. Arthur Morgan's story begins with absence and anger. His mother died when he was still a child. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal drifting from scheme to scheme, dragging his son through saloons, rail camps, and backwater towns. Arthur watched the law not as a source of order, but as the hand that finally closed on Lyle, hauling him away in irons. From its humble beginnings, his life was a lesson. The law did not protect poor families. It separated them. So by his early teens, Arthur was already an outlaw in the truest sense, stealing to eat, fighting to be heard, and learning that mercy was a luxury other people could afford. When Dutch and Hosea first crossed his path, he was trying to rob a man on the road. The irony was almost comical. Two seasoned conmen stumbling across a half-starved teenager attempting the same trick on them. They could have beaten him, turned him in, or ridden on. Instead, they saw a lost soul staring back at them. Dutch saw potential. Hosea saw danger. Together, they made a choice that would define the gang from the very beginning. They did not leave Arthur to rot in a cell or vanish in a shallow grave. They brought him into the firelight. Dutch taught him to read, to argue, to believe that their robberies were a story of resistance rather than simple theft. Freedom, Dutch said, was worth any price as long as a man kept his loyalty and his principles. Hosea's lessons were colder, closer to the ground. He showed Arthur how to case a town without being seen, how to read a mark's posture and eyes, how to walk away before a simple job turned into a massacre. Where Dutch painted the world in sweeping ideals, Hosea traced its cracks and traps. One gave Arthur purpose, the other gave him survival. In that balance, Arthur became what many real gangs depended on, the disciplined lieutenant. Frank James to Dutch's Jesse, Bill Doolin to a makeshift Dalton. Reliable, methodical, the man who could plan an ambush, hold a line under fire, and keep frightened recruits in place through sheer competence. Dutch might dream, Arthur made those dreams operational. Over the years, Dutch stopped seeing just a proc and started seeing a son. Arthur's transformation from abandoned street thief to principled outlaw seemed to prove that Dutch's philosophy worked. If this broken boy could become loyal, thoughtful, almost noble under his guidance, then surely the world was wrong and Dutch was right. But what happens when the son begins to see the cracks the father refuses to admit? That reckoning is coming, and when it arrives, it will shake the entire camp. That reckoning does not arrive all at once. It is forged, slowly, in the fire of 100 small jobs, 100 close calls, 100 choices that turn a boy into the living embodiment of Dutch's creed. From its humble beginnings, Arthur's education is practical, brutal, and strangely idealistic. Dutch takes him on early robberies where the targets are railroad offices, stagecoaches stuffed with company payrolls, and smug-town bankers who sneer at men with mud on their boots. Hosea is there too, watching the exits, watching Arthur, watching Dutch. One teaches him to charge through the front door with a gun in his hand and a speech about freedom on his tongue. The other teaches him to know exactly when to walk away. The pattern repeats. A train job where a guard nearly blows Arthur's head off, saved only because Hosea insisted on scouting the line twice. A bank clerk who panics and reaches for a hidden pistol, only to find Arthur between him and Dutch, taking the beating, absorbing the risk. Over time, Arthur becomes the gang's right hand in the truest sense, the man who rides point on dangerous jobs, who drags wounded comrades out of gunfire, who stands between Dutch's philosophy and the bullets meant to test it. That loyalty is not theoretical. It is bruises, broken ribs, nights spent freezing on lookout while the rest of camp sleeps. When Dutch needs someone to lean on Bill, Arthur does it. When Javier's temper threatens a delicate truce, Arthur is the one who steps in, fists ready, voice low. The gang learns a simple rule. When everything goes wrong, call for Arthur Morgan. He will enforce Dutch's will, hold the line, and make sure the family survives the day. Yet beneath the hardened exterior, something else is taking shape. On the road between scores, Arthur gives spare coins to a starving woman, or quietly unties a farmer who stumbled into the gang's path and was left as a warning. He grumbles, he pretends not to care, but he circles back to help. When an informant is beaten longer than needed, Arthur's jaw tightens, the gun in his hand feels heavier. Is this justice or cruelty hiding behind big words about civilization and progress? This tension mirrors countless real outlaws whose stories haunt the late 19th century. Men such as Frank James or Bill Doolin often began as angry, desperate youths, pulled into gangs that promised family and revenge against a rigged world. For a time, robbery felt righteous, even heroic. Then the bodies piled up, the telegraph wires went up, the Pinkertons spread out, and the world was changing faster than their guns could answer. The old ways were dying, and with them the excuses that once made murder feel like rebellion. Arthur stands exactly at that crossroads. The same ideals that made him believe Dutch's talk of freedom, honor, and resistance now give him the language to question Dutch when the speeches stop matching the blood on the ground. Every act of mercy he shows a stranger, every moment of doubt he swallows in campfire silence, is another crack in the image of the man he calls leader. That fracture will widen with each disastrous plan, each needless death, until the loyal enforcer must decide whether loyalty to Dutch is betrayal of everything Dutch ever claimed to stand for. And when that moment comes, Arthur will not be the only one forced to choose. Arthur's crisis of faith will define the gang's final days, but long before that reckoning, another test of Dutch's philosophy rides into their world. He comes from an even harsher corner of America's forgotten children, another lost soul Dutch believes he can save. John Marston's story begins not in a cabin or a camp, but in an orphanage. From its humble beginnings, his life is a ledger of neglect. His father, an illiterate Scottish immigrant and petty criminal, dies when John is a boy. His mother follows soon after. The institution that takes him in is less a refuge than a warehouse for unwanted lives. Beatings stand in for discipline. Hunger stands in for affection. The lesson is simple. In this civilization, the weak are there to be used. So John runs. Barely a teenager, he takes to the road with no family, no money, and no plan beyond survival. He sleeps in ditches, steals bread, and learns quickly that begging earns contempt faster than it earns coins. Petty crime is not a thrill for him, it is a last resort. When the choice is between starving quietly in a world that has already forgotten his name, or snatching a purse and maybe seeing another sunrise, he chooses the latter. That choice makes him an outlaw long before he meets Dutch. When Dutch and Hosea finally cross his path, the pattern is already familiar. They see a boy on the edge, half feral and half determined. And Dutch recognizes something he cannot resist. Another broken child, another chance to prove that his philosophy can turn pain into purpose. Just as he did with Arthur, he wraps John in grand speeches about freedom and family, about resisting a rigged system that chews up men like this and spits them out as statistics. But from the very beginning, John is not Arthur. Where Arthur is eager to please, hungry for approval, John bristles. He is grateful for food and shelter, but suspicious of sermons. Arthur internalizes Dutch's words, tries to be the living embodiment of that idealistic creed. John listens, nods, then keeps a piece of himself in reserve. He has already learned that every father figure can vanish, every promise can be a prelude to betrayal. Why worship another? In this, John echoes the real outlaws of the late frontier, men like Butch Cassidy and the riders of the Wild Bunch. They operate trains and banks in a world threaded with telegraphs and railroads, where the old ways were dying even as they cling to them. They are too modern to be legends of the 1860s, too wild to fit into the 20th century. John stands in that same limbo, trapped between the dream of the open range and the encroaching fences of progress. Within the gang, this tension becomes personal. John is both little brother and rival to Arthur, walking the same bloody path under Dutch's banner, yet reacting to every turn with a different instinct. When Dutch's plans start to unravel and his ideals curdle into delusions, one son will fight to hold the family together. The other will ask whether this family deserves to survive at all. That question will not just divide them, it will decide who walks away from the age of outlaws, and who is buried with it. From the very beginning, Arthur and John are framed as brothers in arms, not yet rivals in faith. In the early 1890s, they ride side by side on bank jobs and train robberies, the living embodiment of Dutch's promise that this gang is a family, not a hierarchy. They share campfires, scars, and the quiet understanding of men who have both been abandoned by the world and adopted by an outlaw philosophy that claims to offer freedom. In those years, their camaraderie feels effortless. Arthur hauls John out of botched holdups. John backs Arthur when tempers flare with Bill or Javier, and together they become Dutch's favored gun hands. Yet even in that closeness, something else grows. Each time Dutch praises Arthur's discipline or marvels at John's raw talent, a subtle competition takes root. Who is the true heir to this idealistic dream? Who does Dutch really trust when the law closes in? Their personalities sharpen that rivalry. Arthur is the dutiful soldier, the man who rides where Dutch points, who writes in his journal, keeps the books, and enforces camp rules with a gruff, almost resigned loyalty. John is different. Restless, sharp-tongued, a gunslinger who questions why they rob one train and not another, why Dutch's principles bend when the money is good. Where Arthur sees orders, John sees arguments. Where Arthur swallows doubt, John spits it back. Those tensions surface in small, telling disagreements. Around the fire, Dutch launches into another speech about civilization strangling the West, about how the old ways were dying and only the Linde gang stands in defiance. Arthur listens, nods, wants to believe. John listens, frowns, and quietly asks what the endgame is. How long can a man run with a price on his head? How long can a child, like Jack, live in a world of gunsmoke and wanted posters? Arthur's first instinct is frustration. To him, John's disappearances, his doubts, his absences when work needs doing, all look like betrayal of the very family that saved them. John, in turn, sees Arthur as chained to Dutch's delusions, too loyal to admit that the dream is already cracking. This is not unique to them. It echoes real outlaw crews where lieutenants vied for the leader's ear, where men like Frank James or Bill Doolin balanced obedience with ambition until pressure, Pinkertons, or hunger forced a break. Underneath the camaraderie, a story of rivalry and survival is quietly unfolding. In many gangs, the first man to doubt is the first to run, and the one who runs often lives. The truest believer stands his ground, even when the ground is sinking. As Dutch's plans grow wilder and the world was changing faster than any of them can admit, which path will prove fatal? The answer will not arrive all at once. It will come the night one brother walks away, and the other finally asks if he has been riding toward his own grave from the start. The ground is sinking, but the camp is growing. As Dutch talks in circles about freedom and civilization, the first real wave of recruits turns his philosophy into something that looks, at a distance, almost domestic. Bedrolls multiply, fires burn longer, and the gang begins to resemble a wandering village rather than a handful of drifters on the run. From its humble beginnings, that village makes room for those the world has already tried to throw away. Karen Jones arrives as a con artist and a drunk, a woman who has learned that in this world a pistol and a sharp tongue are safer than a wedding ring. Dutch sees a distraction artist, Hosea sees a fellow grifter. Arthur sees someone who can hold her liquor and her nerve. Beneath the bravado, she is a story of escape, from leering men, from dead-end towns, from the quiet suffocation of respectability. Karen's talent with a gun and a bottle echoes real women who stepped outside the script civilization wrote for them. There is something of Belle Starr in her willingness to ride with outlaws and live by the gun, and something of the Annie Oakley showwoman in the way she turns danger into performance, robbing banks in borrowed dresses and laughing through the smoke. The line between criminal and celebrity, between campfire tale and wanted poster, has never been clean, and the gang becomes the living embodiment of that blur. Abigail Roberts enters from the other side of the saloon door. Once a prostitute passed from man to man, she finds in the gang not a fairy tale romance, but a rough, conditional refuge. She cooks, she cleans, she mothers Jack long before John learns how, and she bargains hard for the respect that the outside world refused her. In the truest sense, her presence exposes Dutch's promise of family as both genuine comfort and convenient slogan. Around them gather the early guns. Bill Williamson, a former soldier who left the army with more scars than medals, brings a veteran's discipline and a veteran's temper, echoing countless drifters of the Indian Wars, whose only steady work after the frontier campaigns was to trade one uniform for another kind of gang. Javier Escuela arrives as a revolutionary exile, a man who has already fought for a cause in Mexico and lost, carrying the romantic tragedy of those who believed that the rifle could rewrite history. Each new arrival adds a function and a wound. Cooks and caretakers keep the camp alive, scouts and sharpshooters keep it moving. The illusion is powerful, a society within the cracks of a larger civilization that has no place for them. And in this illusion, RDR2 quietly reflects the real West, where women rode and shot, black cowboys drove cattle north, and immigrants from Mexico and Europe filled the ranges that Hollywood later painted as a boys' club of white gunmen. Yet the old ways were dying even as this little world took shape. How long can a fragile family of lost soul survivors pretend it stands outside history? The answer, for a time, is simple: by turning history's last outlaw decade into an economy. In the truest sense, the van der Linde gang becomes a mobile business of robbery, ransom, and escape, feeding on the very engines of progress that are closing in on them. Their bread and butter work is the classic language of the 1890s frontier. Trains are held at gunpoint in lonely cuts and tunnels, echoing the James, younger gang's assaults on the Iron Mountain Line and the Rock Island. Stagecoaches are stopped on dusty backroads, reins yanked, passengers trembling, a story of fear and reluctant admiration born in a single night. Banks, those proud temples of civilization, are blown open in echoes of Northfield, Minnesota, where the James Younger raid turned a quiet town into a war zone. The world was changing, and railroads stitched it together. Steel rails brought in miners, cattlemen, and speculators, and carried out gold, silver, and grain in amounts no stage could ever manage. To Dutch's philosophy, that made them perfect targets. These trains did not belong to neighbors or small-town merchants. They belonged to distant investors and nameless boards of directors. When the gang robs the Cornwall kerosene and tar train, it mirrors real attacks on Union Pacific and the overland lines, where men like Butch Cassidy saw not just money, but a faceless enemy. Mining booms turn places such as Annisburg and the hills around it into pressure cookers. Paydays arrive in armored cars, banks swell with deposits, and guards grow complacent. In this world, outlaws convince themselves they are rebalancing the scales, even as pockets fill and Dutch's speeches grow grander. Freedom, family, and firepower, purchased with corporate coin, the rhythm of their lives becomes almost ritual. Pull a job. Vanish to a camp in the trees or a ruined plantation. Drink, argue, mend wounds, plan the next score. Then, when Pinkertons or local posses grow too close, the whole caravan moves on. From Coulter's frozen caves to Horseshoe Overlook, from Clemens Point to Shady Bell, their journey mirrors real gangs who drifted from Missouri to Indian Territory to Wyoming, always one step ahead, never truly safe. Rockstar threads specific legends into this pattern. The gang's spectacular train holdup near Wallace Station recalls the Wilcox train robbery of 1899, where Cassidy's wild bunch blew open the Union Pacific's express car and vanished into the Badlands. The tense, urban St. Denis bank heist carries the ghost of Northfield's disaster, where townsfolk fought back and shattered the James Younger mystique in a single bloody afternoon. These are not copies, but remixes, turning familiar crimes into the living embodiment of Dutch's doomed dream. At this stage, it feels sustainable. Money flows, the camp bustles, and Dutch still sounds almost idealistic. Yet beneath the laughter and lantern light, the telegraph hums, rail schedules tighten, and detectives trade stories in distant offices. The illusion holds, for now. But how long can an outlaw economy survive once civilization learns its patterns and starts hunting the men who wrote them? The illusion holds, for now. But beyond the campfires and card games, the world was changing faster than any horse could run. The great promise of the frontier, that distance itself could protect an outlaw, was disappearing under steel rails and humming wire. From its humble beginnings, the railroad had been a symbol of opportunity, of movement, of freedom. By the 1890s, it became something else, a spine of civilization driven straight through outlaw country. Trains no longer just carried cattle and passengers. They carried bank shipments, payrolls, and armed guards. Telegraph lines followed the tracks, thin black veins stretched across the plains, turning days of isolation into minutes of communication. A robbery in one town could be reported to the next 3 stops before the gang even cleared the county line. How do men vanish into the wilderness when the news of their crimes outruns them? For Dutch, this was more than an inconvenience. It was a direct assault on his philosophy. His speeches about freedom and resistance depended on the myth of open space, on the belief that civilization could be dodged, humiliated, outwitted, yet every new rail spur, every telegraph office in a once sleepy town, narrowed the gap between his dreams and the hard reality closing in. The old ways were dying, and the gang did not yet understand that they were riding along a track laid by forces far bigger than any one outlaw. Into this tightening net rode a new kind of hunter, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. In the truest sense, they were the living embodiment of corporate law enforcement, private guns hired by railroads and banks to protect investments and punish those who threatened them. Long before the Linde gang ever existed, Pinkertons had chased the James Younger gang through Missouri back roads and tracked the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy's men, across state lines and even overseas. They were not sheriffs tied to a single county. They were a story of pursuit without borders. Their methods reflected this new world. Undercover agents posed as ranch hands or drifters, drinking in the same saloons as their targets, listening more than boasting. Informants were bought or coerced, a quiet betrayal traded for money or mercy. Case files and telegrams linked distant offices, allowing one detective's observation in Kansas to guide another's ambush in Colorado. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the relentless manhunt for Dutch's gang, led by agents like Milton and Ross, echoes these real tactics. The camp never quite safe, the next move always anticipated, the gang's freedom shrinking with every lead. What began as a romantic, almost idealistic outlaw enterprise now collided with an organized industrial America that treated men like Dutch as problems to be solved, not legends to be feared. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, John, each became anachronisms, clinging to a fading frontier while telegraph keys tapped out their descriptions and railroads delivered their hunters overnight. The gang's family bonds and shared philosophy could not compete with timetables, corporate budgets, and a nation determined to impose order. This is the beginning of the end, though they do not see it yet. The same trains they rob will soon deliver the men who destroy them. The same wires that buzz over their camp will one day carry the message that seals their fate. And when the first true disaster comes, it will not feel random at all, but like the moment a long, careful noose finally tightens. The noose tightens slowly, then snaps all at once. Before Blackwater becomes a byword for disaster, it is, for the Linde gang, a promise. A destination where years of risk, sacrifice, and blood might finally be converted into something approaching peace. In the spring of 1899, the gang is seasoned, not scattered. They have robbed trains, held up coaches, shaken down oilmen and railroad men, and walked away alive. Dutch's philosophy still sounds compelling around the campfire, his voice still the living embodiment of defiance in a world closing in. Arthur serves as the steady right hand, John returns to the fold, and the younger members believe. In the truest sense, that one more big job will buy their freedom. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, compressed into a single looming decision. Blackwater itself is the perfect temptation. It is not a dusty frontier town from its humble beginnings, but a polished, modern port on the upper Montana River, banks with thick vault doors, steamboats heavy with payrolls and investments, telegraph lines humming with speculation and capital. The world was changing, and Blackwater is where that change pools into visible wealth, where civilization flaunts its new money just across the water from the old ways. For an outlaw who preaches that the system is rigged, what better target than the shining symbol of that system's success? Yet, that same modernity makes it deadly. A town with steamboats has timetables. A town with banks has insurance. A town with telegraphs can summon Pinkertons faster than a horse can cross a county. History had already shown what happens when romantic outlaws mistake a growing town for an easy mark. Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch dreamed of final scores too, drifting from the Union Pacific trains to banks and booming settlements, each last job only tightening the federal response. The more they chased a clean exit, the messier the pursuit became. Inside Dutch's camp, the pattern repeats. Hosea, who has survived by reading people and places, feels the shift. He senses that Dutch is not just planning a heist, but trying to prove something to a world that no longer fears him. Quieter voices, Arthur's unease, Charles's caution, even Karen's nervous jokes hint that the stakes are wrong this time. The old ways were dying, and Dutch, rather than adapting, pushes harder, louder, more desperate to show that his philosophy still rules the day. Then comes the decision. The ferry in Blackwater, the promise of a haul big enough to scatter the gang to Mexico, to Canada, to some imagined safe horizon. One last score, one last act of defiance, one last chance to outrun civilization. They ride toward the town as dusk gathers over the water, seeing only the glitter of opportunity. They do not see the rifles being polished, the badges being pinned on, the reports already crossing the wires. At that moment, the Linde gang believes it is riding toward its reward. In truth, it is riding straight into the beginning of its end. They ride in expecting a payday. They ride out leaving smoke, blood, and bodies drifting in the harbor. Blackwater is not just another job gone wrong, it is the moment the dream catches fire and burns the gang from the inside out. The plan, on paper, is grand but simple. Rob a ferry steamboat heavy with cash and bonds, slip back through the town before civilization quite knows what happened, and vanish into the hills richer than ever. Dutch imagines a clean strike against a corrupt world, a story of outlaw justice in the truest sense. Instead, the gang meets prepared lawmen, armed guards on the decks, and civilians packed shoulder to shoulder in the crossfire. A single panicked shot turns tense silence into chaos. Then everything unravels. Gunfire erupts along the waterfront as Pinkerton agents and local deputies pour lead into the gang's position. Horses rear, passengers scream, and the orderly lines of Dutch's philosophy dissolve in the smoke. Some gang members make it aboard the boat, others are pinned on the docks. And no one is quite sure who is giving orders anymore. Civilians fall by accident and by misjudgment, their deaths staining the gang's claim to be the living embodiment of noble rebellion. When the ferry finally burns and sinks, it takes more than money with it. It drags Dutch's illusion of control under the water. The retreat is not a withdrawal, it is a rout. Jenny Kirk dies, Davy Callender is mortally wounded, and several lesser-known associates vanish into the confusion, dead or scattered. The survivors flee north in a ragged column, half-starved, half-frozen, carrying not treasure, but trauma. From its humble beginnings as a roaming band that picked its battles carefully, the Linde gang is now running blind, hunted for a massacre it never meant to commit. For Dutch, Blackwater is the first truly catastrophic failure, the moment his confidence becomes a mask he cannot take off. He feels the guilt. The game makes that clear in his silences and sudden rages. But he cannot allow himself to admit that his own overreach, his refusal to walk away, doomed them. So he blames the Pinkertons, blames the folk, blames traitors real and imagined. How else can a man who built his identity on being right survive being so wrong? History had already written this pattern. In 1876, the James Younger gang rode into Northfield, Minnesota, expecting an easy bank robbery in a quiet town. Instead, armed citizens fought back, gang members died in the streets, and the survivors fled in tatters. That raid, in many ways, was their Blackwater. The world was changing. the old ways were dying, and one disastrous day turned feared outlaws into desperate fugitives. So, it is here. Overnight, the Linde gang becomes the most wanted outfit in the region. Pinkertons coordinate through telegraph lines, local law forms posses, and newspapers print the word massacre beside Dutch's name. From this point forward, the saga changes shape. It stops being about building a dream of freedom and family and becomes a story of running from consequences, of men and women trying to outrun a future that is already waiting for them at the next camp, the next town, the next doomed plan. So the gang runs. Not triumphantly, not as folk heroes disappearing into legend, but as half-frozen fugitives crawling into the teeth of a storm. The massacre at Blackwater drives them upward into the grizzlies, wagons groaning through snowdrifts, lanterns swallowed by white darkness, horses stumbling and dying on the trail as the last light of their old freedom flickers. This is the very beginning of the Coulter chapter, a story of retreat and exhaustion, of an outlaw family that suddenly looks painfully mortal. Jenny Kirk dies on the way. Davy Callender is bleeding out in the wagon. John vanishes in the blizzard, his absence hanging over every whispered conversation. Food runs low, ammunition is counted by the bullet, and every gust of wind sounds, for a moment, like Pinkerton hounds on the ridge below. High in those ruined mining shacks, the Linde camp becomes the living embodiment of a wounded gang in hiding. Real outlaws had done this for decades. Butch Cassidy's wild bunch vanished into the hole-in-the-wall country after failed jobs, while Bill Doolin's men limped into the scrub and canyons of Oklahoma, patching up wounds and nursing grudges. Remote terrain promised safety, yet it also trapped them with their own doubts. The mountains around Coulter perform the same cruel trick. Dutch insists it is only a setback. His voice still carries that preacher's cadence, but the edges are sharper now, the patience thinner. Around the fire, he repeats the same refrain. Blackwater was a fluke, a betrayal, a freak convergence of bad luck and federal overreach. It was not a warning. It was not proof that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying. He cannot allow that thought to exist, because his entire philosophy depends on believing that civilization is the problem, not him. Yet the cracks show. He snaps at Bill, dismisses Javier, leans too heavily on Micah's flattery. Plans that once sounded idealistic and grand now feel improvised, brittle, born from pride more than strategy. In the truest sense, Dutch is already arguing with history itself, trying to shout down the telegraph lines and railroads that have turned the frontier into a map of deadlines and wanted posters. In this frozen limbo, Arthur becomes the stabilizer. He rides into the storm to find John, drags carcasses back to camp so the children can eat, moves from tent to tent with a gruff word or a quiet joke that keeps panic from boiling over. Yet his journal and his silences tell another story. He sees Dutch's eyes darting more often, hears the strain in Hosea's voice, feels loyalty and doubt pulling at the same scarred heart. The gang is cornered on all sides now, the law and Pinkertons tightening below, the blizzard pressing above, and the slow realization that their dreams may already be relics. How long can a philosophy survive when the mountains melt, the snow recedes, and there is nowhere left to run? When the snow begins to thin, and the mountains threaten to spit the gang back into a hostile world. A new presence steps out of the blizzard. Micah Bell arrives in Coulter not as a savior, but as a storm in human form, a brash, violent gunman Dutch takes to almost immediately. From the very beginning, his presence feels wrong. Useful, perhaps, but wrong. Micah is everything Dutch claims to hate and everything he secretly craves. Loud where Hosea is measured, reckless where Arthur is cautious, Micah flatters Dutch's hunger for action and his wounded pride. He boasts about the ferry job at Blackwater, insists it should have worked, and sneers at any suggestion that the gang's dreams are dying. In a world that keeps reminding Dutch that the old ways were dying, Micah becomes the voice that tells him the opposite. On the surface, Micah is just another outlaw. Underneath, he is the living embodiment of opportunism. He pushes for bolder robberies, for bloodier solutions, for confrontations that leave no way back. When others question Dutch's plans, Micah leans in, praising Dutch's genius, insisting that the problem is not the philosophy, but the cowards who hesitate. It is a story of ego and echo, of a leader drifting and a sycophant eager to steer the drift toward chaos. History is full of men like this. In the real American West, Pinkerton detectives made a practice of turning such characters, finding the weak link in a gang and pulling until everything snapped. Informants slipped into outfits run by men like Butch Cassidy or Bill Doolin, sharing campfire jokes one week and selling routes, hideouts, and habits the next. Some were petty criminals caught and flipped. Others were ambitious gunmen who treated loyalty as a temporary convenience, trading their comrades' freedom for their own. Micah fits that mold in the truest sense. He arrives late to the family, Dutch and Hosea, built from its humble beginnings, yet acts as if he has always belonged. He mocks the idea of the gang as a refuge for lost soul drifters and idealistic misfits, turning family into a weapon whenever it suits him. When he kills without restraint in Strawberry, when he starts fights that others must finish, the pattern is clear. His survival first, everyone else a distant second. Dutch, increasingly cornered by civilization and haunted by failure, clings to Micah's flattery. Micah tells him he is still a great man, still a visionary, still a necessary enemy of a corrupt world. Who else is saying that now? Not Hosea, who urges caution. Not Arthur, whose doubts are growing. In that silence, Micah's poison sounds almost like comfort. The betrayals do not begin with a single gunshot or a signed document. They begin with small lies, with missing shares, with whispered conversations near the edge of camp. They begin when a man smiles at Dutch and then watches Pinkertons from the shadows. The question is not whether such a man will sell the gang out, but when, and how much of Dutch's crumbling dream he will take with him when he does. Those small lies follow the gang out of the snow and into greener country. After Coulter's frozen misery, the move to Horseshoe Overlook feels, in the truest sense, like waking from a nightmare. The grass is high, the river runs clear, the wagons can finally breathe. For a moment, the Van der Linde camp almost resembles a traveling village instead of a fugitive outfit. Dutch seizes on that illusion. From the very beginning of their time near Valentine, he speaks of fresh starts, of Blackwater as an unfortunate detour on the road to freedom, rather than the disaster that shattered his authority. Around the campfire, his voice rolls through the trees. One more score, one more train, one more job, and then Tahiti, or Australia, or some other distant paradise where civilization cannot reach them. Each place shifts, but the promise stays the same. The work reflects that same denial. Arthur rides into Valentine to collect debts, break up disputes, and quietly assess which stores can be leaned on without drawing too much heat. The town is rough but alive, a story of cowhands, drifters, and merchants trying to carve out a living at the edge of a world that no longer needs gunslingers. The gang blends in by pretending to be what they once were at their most idealistic: travelers, ranch hands, laborers between jobs. Yet the mask never stays on for long. A simple drink in the saloon turns into a legendary bar fight, with Arthur and Javier trading punches through windows while the locals cheer. A stagecoach is borrowed on a back road and never returned. A Valentine poker game ends with Dutch's men walking away a little richer, and the other players wondering whether they were just outplayed or quietly robbed. It is the living embodiment of outlaw life, hiding in plain sight. Real gangs had done this for decades. The James brothers, the Doolin gang, countless lesser names moved from town to town, setting up in boarding houses, ranches, and mining camps, convincing themselves that a new address meant a new beginning. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. Railroads, telegraphs, and agencies like the Pinkertons stitched the continent together, turning distance into an inconvenience rather than a shield. That same pressure tightens around Dutch. Every new camp feels, for a week or two, like a reset, a chance to prove that his philosophy still works. Then news of Pinkerton's sightings arrives, bounties go up, and his decisions grow more erratic, more violent, more desperate. How long can a man insist that freedom is just over the next horizon when the horizon keeps shrinking? The gang keeps moving, Horseshoe to Clemens Point to Shady Bell, each camp another attempt to outrun consequences. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, this pattern becomes the quiet drumbeat beneath the gunfire. It mirrors the fate of real outlaws who bounced from hideout to hideout, never admitting that the frontier had ended. The question is not whether the net will close, but how many will be caught in it when Dutch finally runs out of places to run. Dutch keeps running. But in the frozen wreckage of Coulter, the gang stumbles on someone who has already lost the race. Sadie Adler's story begins in a burned-out cabin, her husband's body hanging from a rafter, the snow outside trampled by O'Driscoll horses and stained with blood. From the very beginning, her presence is a reminder that the feud between Dutch and Colm is not just an outlaw rivalry, it is a private war that devours civilians. Arthur and the others find her half mad with grief, knife in hand, ready to kill or be killed. The gang drags her out of that tomb of a home, rescuing her in the truest sense, and yet also pulling her into their own doomed orbit. The world was changing, but for Sadie, it had already ended. The old ways were dying: marriage, homestead, quiet frontier life, replaced by the cold logic of survival. She enters the gang not as a recruit, but as collateral damage. At first, Dutch and Hosea try to place her where civilization expects a woman to be, in camp, near the fire, under Susan Grimshaw's watchful eye. Sadie is told to cook, to sew, to wait. She refuses. Her grief is not passive, it is volatile. She pushes back against every attempt to sideline her, insisting on carrying a gun, demanding to ride on jobs, forcing the gang to see that the widow in the apron is as dangerous as any man with a rifle. Her evolution from mourning wife to relentless gunslinger is not a sudden turn, it is a slow ignition. In that, Sadie echoes real women who stepped across the invisible lines drawn by a patriarchal frontier. Belle Starr, the so-called bandit queen, rode with horse thieves and robbers, dressing with a deliberate theatricality that dared the world to underestimate her. Annie Oakley, a sharpshooter who could split playing cards in midair, toured the country proving that skill with a gun was not a male birthright. Sadie is the living embodiment of that tradition, an outlaw forged by loss, a marksman who answers violence with precision rather than rhetoric. Her arc becomes a story of what happens when the marginalized stop asking for protection and start taking power. Pushed to the edges by violence and by the quiet condescension of the men around her, Sadie abandons any idealistic dreams of freedom or family and embraces a brutal honesty. Enemies must be hunted, debts must be paid in blood. Where Dutch's philosophy curdles into self-serving delusions and cowardice, her trauma hardens into purpose. He talks about codes, she lives by a ledger of names. In the end, Sadie stands as Dutch's sharpest mirror, an outlaw who has no illusions about what she is, and no intention of running from it. The question becomes clear: in a world closing in, who is more dangerous? The man still preaching, or the woman who has already buried her last illusion? Sadie is one mirror for Dutch's failing dream. Charles Smith and Lenny Summers are another. Through them, the gang stops being a collection of colorful outlaws and becomes a story of who the frontier really used and then tried to forget. Charles enters almost quietly, a man of mixed native and black heritage, tall, reserved, moving with the patience of a hunter who has spent more nights under open sky than under any roof. From the very beginning, he is the gang's tracker, its best shot with a bow, the one who can read broken branches and faint hoofprints the way others read newspapers. In a camp full of loud voices and louder egos, he is a calm, moral presence, speaking only when it matters, acting when others hesitate. His existence cuts against the myth. Popular stories of the West imagine a white gunman facing a faceless wilderness, but the real frontier was built on the labor and skill of native and black cowboys. Historians estimate that 1 in 4 cowboys driving cattle north from Texas was black. Many were formerly enslaved men who found in the trail a harsh but tangible version of freedom. Native scouts guided the army, guided traders, guided prospectors, then were discarded when treaties were broken and reservations carved their worlds apart. Charles is the living embodiment of those erased hands, the man who keeps everyone fed, patched up, and moving, even as the world was changing around them. Lenny Summers stands on the other side of that same truth. Young, educated, sharp as broken glass, he reads, he thinks, he argues. He is not just another gun, he is ambition with a notebook. In Saint Denis, his eyes light up at the sight of electric lights and libraries, yet every door that might have opened for him is nailed shut by racism and the unspoken rules of a civilization that has no place for a black man with dreams. So he ends up here, robbing banks with Dutch van der Linde, discussing philosophy between shootouts. Together, Charles and Lenny reveal a harder question. How many outlaws were simply people pushed outside the law by design? Racist black codes, lynch mobs, stolen land, broken treaties, and economic exclusion turned entire communities into refugees within their own country. The gang's campfire becomes a crossroads where the displaced, the hunted, and the unwanted gather because there is nowhere else to go. Rockstar anchors this in the wider tragedy through characters like Rainsfall and Eagle Flies. Charles' loyalty to the Wapiti, his horror at the government's lies, and the sight of a starving tribe penned into bad land echo real policies like the Dawes Act, which shattered native landholding in the name of progress. Dutch claims to fight civilization. The game shows that its victims are already all around him. From its humble beginnings as a band of misfits chasing freedom, the Van der Linde gang ends up walking through the wreckage of cultures and lives that were broken long before Dutch ever gave a speech. In the truest sense, Charles and Lenny are not side characters. They are the cost. And as the story turns toward Pinkertons and railroads, that cost is only going to rise. Saint Denis is where the dream walks into the glare of civilization and finally sees itself. The gang rides in out of the swamps, and, in an instant, the world is louder, brighter, and utterly indifferent to them. Electric lights burn through the night, humming over brick streets and iron tracks. Streetcars rattle past in sparks and screeches, cutting through crowds of workers, vendors, and carriages that never seem to stop. Smoke pours from chimneys, factories pound out a mechanical heartbeat, and the air itself feels bought and sold. For men who had ruled empty plains and quiet timber, Saint Denis is a sensory assault that makes them feel small. Here, an outlaw on horseback is just another obstacle for a cab driver to curse at. Dutch feels that humiliation more than anyone. From the very beginning, his philosophy depended on being the living embodiment of resistance. The man who could stride into a town and bend it around his will. In Saint Denis, the city barely notices him. So he rails against it. He calls it a cesspit of corruption, a monument to greed, a place where dreams go to die. Yet in the same breath, he starts chasing its biggest prizes, high-stakes bank jobs, backroom deals with men in suits, whispered promises of political leverage. The city itself echoes real Gilded Age giants, drawing on New Orleans docks and brothels, Chicago's rail yards and slaughterhouses, and the choking smoke of Pittsburgh's mills. This is a story of industrial wealth stacked directly on top of brutal poverty, of mansions and tenements sharing the same filthy river. Dutch claims to hate that contrast, to despise the men who profit from it. But he cannot resist the stage it offers him. In Saint Denis, his contradictions sharpen. He speaks of freedom and the common man, yet he courts Angelo Bronte, a crime lord who feeds on immigrant misery. He insists the gang is family, in the truest sense, yet he is willing to march that family into a downtown bank under Pinkerton surveillance just to prove he can still outplay civilization. Each scheme becomes less about survival and more about prestige. Each speech about loyalty is followed by another risk that someone else will pay for. The irony is cruel. Dutch once robbed stagecoaches and trains to strike at a system he claimed was rigged. Now he is trying to climb that same system's marble steps, bargaining with the very elites he said he would tear down. Is he still a rebel, or just another ambitious man in a city full of them? Saint Denis is the point where the old ways were dying in full view. Telegraph wires hum overhead, railroads cut through the horizon, and Pinkertons walk openly with the backing of federal law and corporate money. The gang's mythic self-image, from its humble beginnings as a roaming family of outcasts, shatters against the machinery of modern capitalism. And when that machinery finally grinds into motion against them, the cost will be more than Dutch's pride. That machinery has a name. In Red Dead Redemption 2, it walks on two legs, carries a badge and a ledger, and introduces itself as Agent Milton and Agent Ross of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. From the very beginning of the gang's flight after Blackwater, these men are not random lawmen. They are the living embodiment of a new order that studies, tracks, and dismantles outlaws as if they were a problem to be solved on paper. Milton and Ross do not simply ride in and trade bullets. They listen. They watch. They buy information. Their methods are modern, surveillance from a distance, informants in saloons and rail depots, coordinated raids on camps and hideouts that strike at dawn with terrifying precision. The ambush at the Cornwall train, the assault on Shady Bell, the noose tightening at Beaver Hollow, each feels less like a duel and more like a calculation. How can a wandering family of dreamers compete with ledgers, telegraphs, and paid spies? This is not fantasy. The real Pinkerton National Detective Agency built its power on exactly these tactics. In the truest sense, it was a private intelligence service for the age of railroads and steel. Pinkerton operatives infiltrated labor unions, broke strikes with hired gunmen, and gathered dossiers on agitators who threatened corporate profits. When coal miners or steelworkers demanded dignity, Pinkertons answered with rifle fire and batons, turning industrial disputes into small-scale wars that scarred the American story. At the same time, the agency hunted the very outlaws, whose legends would later feed Dutch's philosophy. It was Pinkerton pursuit that helped drive the James Younger gang into disaster, forcing them toward the doomed Northfield raid as law and pressure closed in. It was Pinkerton pressure, federal coordination, and railroad money that pushed Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch further and further from home, until South America seemed safer than the American frontier. Every step of progress narrowed the map. Every wanted poster made the next robbery more desperate. So when Milton leans on Micah Bell, turning a swaggering gunman into an informant, the game is echoing real turncoats and collaborators who sold out gangs to save themselves. Is Micah a unique monster, or just another lost soul choosing survival over loyalty once the odds shift? The line between outlaw and Pinkerton asset blurs, and with it the simple story of good versus evil that Dutch keeps preaching to his followers. Because the Pinkertons are both. They are instruments of law and hired guns for corporations, guardians of civilization and mercenaries for capital. They claim to defend order, yet answer to whoever can afford their fee. In that contradiction, the world was changing. The old ways were dying, not in a blaze of glory, but under contracts, court orders, and private armies that could cross state lines faster than any posse. For Dutch, these men are the faceless enemy killing freedom. For the new America, they are progress in a tailored coat. And as their net tightens around the Linde gang, another, quieter hunter begins to close in, one that cannot be shot off a horse or blown up with dynamite. That quieter hunter is doubt. Not the law, not the Pinkertons, but the slow, corrosive realization that the man at the center of this family is no longer the man he claims to be. From this point on, every speech Dutch gives is a promise, and every promise costs more blood. On the surface, nothing changes. Around the campfire, Dutch still talks about freedom, about loyalty, about civilization closing in and one more score that will let the gang disappear. He repeats the same phrases that once sounded idealistic and defiant. They are not criminals, he insists, but a story of resistance in the truest sense, the living embodiment of a dying frontier. Yet each time he says it now, the plan that follows is riskier, sloppier, more willing to spill civilian blood for a chance at escape. The St. Denis bank heist is the clearest fracture. Dutch orders heavy fire in a crowded city, turns a robbery into a massacre, and when Hosea and Lenny die, he calls it necessary sacrifice. After Guarma, he returns with a new mantra, trust him or leave. He tolerates Micah's cruelty, excuses torture and executions as strategy, and abandons people who do not fit the new vision. The man who once lectured about not harming innocents now shrugs off blown-up trolleys and dead bystanders as the price of doing business. The betrayals of his own code come faster. He leaves John to rot after the train job near Strawberry, dismissing rescue as too dangerous. He lets Pearson, Tilly, and others fend for themselves while he chases impossible scores. Most telling of all, he keeps Micah close, granting him influence Dutch once reserved for Hosea and Arthur, even as Micah mocks the gang's old philosophy and pushes for colder, more brutal tactics. When did the outlaw who preached family begin treating that family as expendable? Arthur feels the shift first. The loyal lieutenant, who once enforced Dutch's orders without question, starts to see the gap between the words and the world in front of him. He watches Dutch promise safety, then march them into Pinkerton traps. He hears speeches about loyalty, then sees John's family left behind, sees the wapiti used, sees Cornwall's men and innocent townsfolk alike gunned down to prove a point. Doubt turns to quiet defiance. John, who never fully believed from the very beginning, stops hiding his contempt. He calls Dutch out, challenges the endless one more score, and dreams of leaving with Abigail and Jack. His arc mirrors those real outlaws who survived long enough to recognize a doomed leader. Men in the James Younger or Doolin gangs who watched their chiefs grow paranoid, self-serving, even willing to hand over their own men to save themselves. This is where the Linde gang's cohesion truly begins to break. When the father figure stops living by his own rules, the family fractures. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's dream, from its humble beginnings, had become a prison. The next cracks will not be philosophical. They will be fatal. Those fractures become fault lines in Saint Denis. The dream of freedom Dutch preached from its humble beginnings meets brick, gaslight, and marble, and Hosea can feel the walls closing in long before the gang ever steps into that bank. By this point, Hosea is watching Dutch with a quiet, mounting alarm. The man who once argued for patience, for choosing the right score at the right moment, now chases grand gestures and impossible paydays. Hosea urges smaller jobs, cleaner exits, maybe even a real retirement somewhere in the north. He talks of buying a little place, of fishing and reading, of an old outlaw ending his days in peace rather than in chains. Dutch hears him, smiles, and then reaches for something bigger. The world was changing, and Dutch is determined to shout over the noise. In camp, Hosea becomes the living embodiment of restraint. He counsels Arthur to keep an eye on Dutch, to think before pulling the trigger, to remember that their philosophy once meant protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. He tries to negotiate safer paths with Leviticus Cornwall, with Angelo Bronte, with anyone who might offer a way out that does not end in a massacre. But every conversation circles back to the same hard truth. Dutch will not be steered anymore. So when the Saint Denis bank job is set in motion, Hosea goes along, not because he believes in it, but because he believes in the family trapped inside Dutch's delusions. His role is not to shoot, it is to talk. Captured on the street, paraded before the bank as a bargaining chip, Hosea remains calm, almost resigned. He has always known this story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, could only end a few ways. This is one of them. On that balcony, with Pinkertons below and the gang inside, the bargain is clear. Hosea's life for surrender. Yet Dutch hesitates, rants, reaches for dynamite and destiny instead of mercy. In the truest sense, this is the moment the gang's conscience is put on the gallows. When Milton executes Hosea in front of Dutch and Arthur, it is more than a killing. It is the public murder of restraint, of doubt, of the man who could still say no and make it stick. Real outlaw outfits knew this pattern well. When the older planner, the cautious brother, the Frank James or Bill Doolin figure, was jailed or shot, violence spiked. Younger men, unmoored from that moderating voice, rushed into suicidal robberies, turned on each other, or sold each other to detectives. Civilization did not have to crush them, they tore themselves apart. In the smoking chaos after Hosea's death, that same spiral begins. Dutch's grief curdles into a hard, vengeful certainty that compromise is weakness and mercy is treason. Arthur's sorrow becomes doubt, a crack in his faith that will only widen. And into the silence Hosea leaves behind walks Micah Bell, whispering bloodier counsel, promising victory through brutality. With the conscience silenced, who is left to pull Dutch back from the edge? The answer to that question will define every betrayal that follows. The answer arrives not in a council of war or a calm discussion, but in a panic-stricken flight through the streets of Saint Denis. Sirens, gunshots, and shouted orders close in as the Saint Denis bank heist collapses. Hosea is dead, Lenny is dead, and the gang's dreams of one last score dissolve into blind terror as they scramble for the docks and throw themselves onto a ship bound for nowhere. The escape is not a victory. It is a shipwreck in slow motion. A storm tears the vessel apart, men are swept overboard, and the remnants of Dutch's family wash up on the black sands of Guarma, half drowned and delirious. From its humble beginnings and the snowy desperation of Coulter, the gang has been on the run, but this is different. This is exile. When Arthur staggers awake under a blazing tropical sun, he is no longer in the familiar West. He is in a fever dream. Guarma is a story of interruption, of violent tear in the narrative fabric. One moment the gang is battling Pinkertons and city lawmen. The next they are crawling through jungle, hunted by guards who do not even speak their language. It feels unreal, because it is meant to. The world was changing, the old ways were dying. And the game rips the characters out of their usual context to show what their philosophy looks like when stripped of myth and home turf. Beneath the palm trees and bright water lies a colonial nightmare. Sugar plantations run by the ruthless Alberto Fusar mirror the real American and Caribbean empires of the late 19th century, where corporations and governments merged into a single iron fist. Striking workers are gunned down, rebels are tortured, and foreign capital dictates life and death. In the truest sense, Guarma is not an escape from civilization. It is civilization with the mask torn off. Dropped into this world, Dutch recognizes opportunity rather than horror. He allies with the local rebels, promises freedom, speaks about tyranny and injustice with the same fire that once inspired starving drifters on the American frontier. Yet his actions betray the words. He uses rebels as shock troops, abandons allies when plans change, and treats local lives as expendable bargaining chips in his private war against whoever stands in his way. Loyalty becomes a tool, not a value. On Guarma, Dutch is the living embodiment of his own corruption. He negotiates with plantation masters while claiming to fight them, sacrifices men he barely knows for a cause he barely understands, and convinces himself that every betrayal serves some higher purpose. If he can justify atrocities here, on foreign soil, what will stop him from doing the same to his own people once they return? For Arthur, the island is not adventure, but revelation. Each broken promise, each dead rebel, each frantic escape through cane fields underlines a terrifying truth. Dutch has become untethered from the very beginning, from the idealistic code that once guided them. Guarma ends with another desperate flight, another stolen boat, another storm. But something does not wash away this time. Doubt follows them back to America, and it will not let go. Because if Dutch could lose himself on Guarma, what will the mainland take from him next? They come back to America as ghosts, the battered remnants of a once proud caravan, washing up on the shores near Van Horn with fewer wagons, fewer guns, and far fewer illusions. From its humble beginnings as an idealistic band of misfits, the Linde gang is now the living embodiment of a dream that refuses to die, even as the world was changing without them. The return from Guarma strips away the romance. Hosea is gone, Lenny is gone, the money from Blackwater is gone, and the Pinkertons are closer than ever. Dutch limps back onto the mainland with grand declarations of one last score, one last escape, one last chance at freedom. But the more he speaks of philosophy and destiny, the more his promises sound desperate, even delusional. The old ways were dying, and Dutch is the only one who refuses to hear the funeral bells. In the middle of this collapse stands Arthur Morgan, coughing into a bloodied handkerchief. What begins as fatigue and irritation hardens into a diagnosis, tuberculosis, a death sentence in that era, for an outlaw who has survived bullets, bounty hunters, and blizzards. It is not a shootout that will kill him, but breath itself. That quiet cruelty forces him to look back on his story, on decades of loyalty, violence, and blind faith in Dutch's dream. Many real outlaws never lived long enough to grow old and reflective. Frank James watched his brother Jesse die young and spent his later years haunted by the choices they made. Bill Doolin, another gang lieutenant, was gunned down in his 30s, his body broken by injuries and relentless pursuit. Others drank themselves into early graves, their bodies failing them only when their guns finally fell silent. They were legends in dime novels, but in the truest sense, they were men who only understood the cost of their lives when it was already too late. Arthur reaches that point of clarity while he is still breathing. Illness peels away his excuses. He begins to help strangers with no profit involved, to protect the weak instead of preying on them. He rides with Charles to rescue captives, aids rains fall, hands money to those crushed by civilization's advance. Each act is a small rebellion against the man he has been, and against the man Dutch is becoming. How can he keep calling this family if it now survives on betrayal? This is the pivot. Arthur stops being Dutch's unquestioning right hand and becomes the moral protagonist of the story, challenging Dutch openly, urging John to take Abigail and Jack and run. He sees that the gang is no longer a refuge, but a trap. That freedom for John's family might mean abandoning everything they ever built. The question is no longer whether the dream can be saved. It is whether anyone can still be saved from the dream. And as Arthur's body fails him, Dutch's grip on reality slips in tandem, setting the stage for a final choice that will define them both. As Dutch drifts into grand delusion and Arthur's body begins to fail, John Marston reaches his own breaking point. The gang's dream of freedom has curdled into a story of exhaustion, near-death escapes, and the quiet terror of a man who realizes the next bullet might leave his son an orphan. The very beginning of John's disillusionment lies in a simple, brutal truth: Dutch keeps leaving him to die, At Coulter, John staggers back half frozen and mauled by wolves after being sent ahead and effectively abandoned. Later, in St. Denis and Guarma, he is treated less as family and more as expendable muscle, a gang soldier to be spent. Each time, Dutch sacrifices him for another plan. The old ways were dying in John's mind. Replaced by a hard question, what is this loyalty really worth? Abigail and Jack become the answer. Abigail, who has seen the worst of the gang from its humble beginnings, pushes John to imagine something different, something quieter than Dutch's endless speeches. Jack, reading dime novels about noble gunslingers, looks at his father as the living embodiment of those myths. While John knows the truth is closer to blood and mud than heroism, how can a man teach his son about honor while riding for a leader who treats him as collateral? Historically, John's struggle mirrors the last generation of real outlaws who tried to step away as the world was changing. Men such as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid fled to new countries, others changed names and took ranch work, hoping distance and fences could bury their past. Many ended up like John will one day be forced to live, half farmer, half fugitive, pulled between civilization's demands and the long reach of the law. In the truest sense, John's arc channels every gunslinger who tried to trade a revolver for a branding iron and found the past waiting at the gate. Inside the gang, this shift turns into open conflict. John begins to question Dutch's philosophy, refusing to ride on certain suicidal errands, pushing back when Dutch dismisses Abigail's fears. Dutch, who demands absolute faith, frames every doubt as betrayal. A man who once called John son now accuses him of cowardice, of selfishness, of choosing one small family over the larger cause. Is it betrayal to walk away from a burning house, or madness to stay inside out of principle? These confrontations echo real gangs where lieutenants who questioned the leader's vision were frozen out, set up, or abandoned during jobs. John watches Dutch favor Micah's ruthless obedience over Arthur's and his own moral hesitation, and he understands the message: thoughtfulness is treason. Conscience is weakness. The campfire stories of shared dreams give way to tense silences and whispered accusations. By the time the gang reaches Beaver Hollow, John stands at a crossroads Arthur has already begun to walk. Will he follow Arthur toward a painful moral reckoning, or cling to Dutch's dying dream until it buries him? The answer will decide not only his fate, but the fate of the family he is finally brave enough to claim. John's crossroads becomes Dutch's excuse. At Beaver Hollow, as John pulls away to protect Abigail and Jack, Micah steps into the space between father and son, between doubt and delusion, and begins to spin a story of his own. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, with Micah Bell casting himself as the last true believer in Dutch's fading philosophy. From the very beginning of Beaver Hollow, Micah understands what Dutch needs more than the truth. He feeds him flattery and fear in equal measure, praising Dutch as a visionary while whispering that Arthur and John no longer understand the mission. Every failed job becomes proof of treachery. Every question Arthur asks becomes insubordination. Micah positions himself as the living embodiment of loyalty, the only outlaw still willing to do what must be done for freedom and family. The pattern that follows is too neat to be coincidence, yet Dutch is too wounded to see it. Lawmen arrive just a little too quickly at camp, at meetings, at robberies that were meant to be secret. The botched rescue of John, the ambushes in St. Denis, the way Pinkerton seemed to know the gang's direction before the wagons even roll out, each event tightens the noose. And somehow, Micah always walks away unscathed, his gun smoking, his story ready. History is full of men exactly like him. The Pinkertons made an art of planting informants inside outlaw bands, from the James Younger gang to the Wild Bunch. Sometimes it was a hired man. Sometimes it was a longtime member who decided civilization's money spent better than outlaw loyalty. They passed on routes, hideouts, and planned robberies, and their betrayal only surfaced when the gang lay dead or in chains. Micah stands in that tradition in the truest sense, a smiling knife at the campfire. For Dutch, already destabilized by Hosea's death, the St. Denis disaster, and the slow erosion of his myth, Micah's version of events is a lifeline. Accept Arthur's accusations, and Dutch must admit he has failed his sons, lost his way, and led his family to ruin. Believe Micah, and the dream still lives. The problem is not the philosophy, but the traitors who no longer deserve it. Between admitting he is wrong and blaming those who doubt him, Dutch chooses the path that protects his ego. Micah becomes the gang's rot-made flesh. No code, no higher dream, no idealistic vision of a better world. Only survival, cruelty, and profit. He twists Dutch's language of freedom into justification for butchery, turns family into leverage, and converts every act of mercy into a weakness to be exploited. The old ways were dying, but Micah is not the future. He is the vulture feeding on the corpse of a lost soul of a gang. The question is not whether he is lying. The question is how far the Pinkertons will let their pet monster run before they finally pull the leash, and who will be left standing when they do. The leash is invisible, but the damage is not. It reaches all the way into the heart of the camp, where the real story of the Linde gang's collapse is written not in gunfights, but in glances, arguments, and the slow erosion of trust. Once, camp was laughter, music, and shared hardship. From its humble beginnings, it had been a refuge in a hostile world. Now, the firelight at Beaver Hollow throws harsher shadows. Conversations stop when someone walks past. Cards are played with one hand and kept near a holster with the other. Whispered accusations of betrayal float through the trees, and every missing dollar from the money box feels like a death sentence waiting to be handed down. The first cracks are loud. Men argue over shares from jobs that keep going wrong. Bill shouts that someone is skimming. Javier snaps that the real thieves wear badges. Karen drinks harder and laughs at both of them, but the laughter has an edge. This is no longer a family defending its freedom. It is a collection of frightened outlaws counting bullets and coins, wondering who will run first. Into this tension steps Arthur, no longer the unquestioning enforcer. He begins to challenge Dutch openly, not with rebellion for its own sake, but with the weary clarity of a man who has seen too many graves. Why protect Micah? Why trust Bronte's promises? Why keep chasing impossible scores when civilization is closing in on every side? Each question is a crack in Dutch's philosophy, each doubt a reminder that the old ways were dying faster than his pride could accept. Sadie, forged in her own furnace of loss, takes a different path. She sides with action over Dutch's swelling speeches, volunteering for every rescue, every raid that has a clear purpose beyond Dutch's grand designs. Her loyalty is to people, not plans. John, meanwhile, begins to step back, pulled between Abigail, Jack, and a future that might not involve Dutch at all. His silences speak louder than his gun ever did. Dutch feels this distance like a personal betrayal. In the truest sense, he doubles down. The rhetoric grows more fevered, the punishments harsher. Dissent is branded treason. He isolates those who question him, elevates those who flatter him, and uses fear to hold together what love and respect no longer can. The gang that once seemed the living embodiment of chosen family now moves with the wary obedience of a cult orbiting a fading star. This implosion echoes the final days of real outlaw bands, Jesse James turning paranoid and violent against supposed traitors, the Doolin gang splintering under pressure, leaders everywhere trading reason for rage as Pinkertons and posses closed in. It is a story of loyalty curdling into suspicion, of dreams collapsing into delusions, of every lost soul realizing too late that the family they found has become the most dangerous place to stay. The tragedy is simple. They did not just lose their freedom, they lost faith in one another. And once that is gone, what is left to die for? In the end, the gang does not explode in one glorious last stand. It rots from the inside, until Arthur Morgan understands the simplest, hardest truth of all. The Linde gang cannot be saved. Only the people trapped inside it can. In that realization, the story of a loyal enforcer becomes the story of a dying man trying to carve out one clean thing before the curtain falls. From its humble beginnings, Arthur believed Dutch's campfire sermons about freedom, family, and fighting a corrupt civilization. Hosea's death, the Blackwater disaster, the bodies left across Rhodes and St. Denis, each loss chipped away at that faith. But the breaking point comes when he looks at John, Abigail, and Jack and sees something Dutch no longer sees. A future. Not for the gang as a grand philosophy, but for a single, battered family that can still walk away. Tuberculosis turns that insight into urgency. Every cough is a clock. Every job is a gamble with hours he no longer owns. So Arthur does what real enforcers in the old outlaw world sometimes did when the dream soured. He starts planning for someone else's escape. He helps Abigail. He pushes John to think beyond the next score. And he quietly accepts that his own road now runs in only one direction, yet he still needs money. Freedom costs something, even when the old ways were dying. That is why his last rides are not just about sentiment, they are about securing the gang's hidden funds and prying loose the cash that might give John's family a chance to disappear. The irony is sharp. The man who spent his life stealing for Dutch now steals time and money back from Dutch's delusions. At the same time, Arthur turns toward confrontation. Micah Bell, the living embodiment of treachery in a world built on outlaw loyalty, has become Dutch's new shadow. Arthur's illness weakens his body, but it clarifies his vision. He sees Micah's whispers, the betrayals, the Pinkerton connections, and he understands that as long as Micah lives at Dutch's side, no one is safe. So he pushes John to leave, even as he rides toward the gunfight that might kill him. This is where the game leans into the old romantic legends of the dying gunslinger who earns redemption with one final act, yet refuses to let it dissolve into pure myth. Arthur is not a spotless hero, he is a man with blood on his hands, trying in the truest sense to make sure Jack does not grow up to be another lost soul with a gun. All of it builds toward that last climb up the mountain, where thin air and failing lungs will meet Micah's treachery and Dutch's final unmasking. What happens when a believer stands before the prophet and sees only a frightened outlaw chasing ghosts? That last climb is not just a change in elevation, it is the Linde philosophy dragging itself toward execution. The storm howls, the snow blinds, and on that narrow spine of rock, the gang's entire story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, finally tears itself apart. Arthur reaches the summit ruined in body but sharpened in purpose. Tuberculosis has hollowed him out, his lungs burning in the thin air, yet he still throws himself at Micah with a fury that feels older than both men. Fists crash against bone, boots skid on ice, knives flash in the whiteout. Two outlaws, once brothers in arms, now reduced to animals clawing in the snow while the world was changing beneath them. And watching, framed by the storm, stands Dutch. Coat flapping, eyes distant, he is the living embodiment of the gang's past promises and present rot. Arthur, bleeding and gasping, fights not only Micah's knife, but Dutch's silence. Micah, snarling and desperate, spits poison about betrayal, about rats, about survival at any cost. Each punch is a question. Which son does Dutch truly believe in now? Pinned and fading, Arthur makes his final appeal. He does not beg for his own life. He begs for clarity, for Dutch to see Micah for what he is, a parasite feeding on paranoia, a man whose loyalty has always been for sale. He reminds Dutch of the very beginning, of those idealistic speeches about freedom, about family, about never abandoning their own. He asks for one last mercy, not for himself, but for John and Abigail and Jack. Let them go. Let at least one branch of this poison tree grow straight. Dutch hesitates. That is the most damning act of all. In that pause, the entire distance from its humble beginnings to this frozen nightmare becomes visible. He looks at Arthur, the son who believed in him in the truest sense. He looks at Micah, the mirror of his own growing cruelty. He chooses neither. He simply turns and walks away. It is a quiet betrayal, and therefore a deeper one. Dutch does not pull the trigger to kill Arthur, nor does he raise a hand to save him. He abandons him to the mountain and to Micah's blade, abandoning, at the same time, the last honest defender of his philosophy. This is how many outlaw legends truly end, not in a heroic last stand, but in confusion, in broken trust, in the cold realization that the old ways were dying long before the bullets flew. When Arthur finally collapses, watching the sunrise break over a world he will never see remade, the Linde gang dies as an idea, long before its last members fall. Dutch's dream has no witness left who believes it. Only survivors and ghosts remain. But Dutch is not finished yet, and neither is Micah, and the next time they meet, the mountain will remember. Arthur dies with the sun on his face, but the consequences of that mourning keep spreading like smoke through the mountains. The Linde gang is gone in the truest sense, its idea shattered, its family broken, but its survivors do not vanish all at once. They splinter, they scatter, they become rumors drifting through a world that no longer has room for their kind of freedom. In the immediate aftermath, those who can run, Javier slips south toward Mexico. Bill finds work as a hired gun in the territories. Charles and Sadie disappear into their own hard-won paths. Dutch simply walks away from the ridge, leaving Arthur's body and Micah's wheezing fury behind, stepping into the fog as if the mountain itself has swallowed him. From that day, Dutch exists more in whispers than in wanted posters, a living ghost blamed for robberies he did not plan and sightings he never confirms. These are Dutch's ghost years. From its humble beginnings, his gang had been a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged against civilization. Now the living embodiment of that philosophy drifts from town to town, sometimes gathering 2 or 3 desperate men, sometimes trying to resurrect the old pattern with a new campfire and a new speech about the world being rigged. But the old ways were dying, and so was his hold over others. The charisma is thinner, the plan smaller, the payoffs meaner. He is no longer the prophet of an idealistic crusade, only an aging outlaw chasing the echo of his own legend. History is full of men who end this way. Jesse James gunned down in a friend's house, Bill Doolin shot in a moonlit ambush, Butch Cassidy likely dying nameless in a foreign country rather than in a glorious last stand. Dutch joins that tradition of the fading gunman, a lost soul wandering the edges of a civilization he once swore to defy. The world was changing faster than his philosophy could bend, and his legend is already turning into a cautionary tale told in saloons. Micah's path is the opposite of Dutch's drift. Where Dutch dissolves into rumor, Micah hardens into a bunker. He claws his way to a fortified mountain hideout, hoarding the remnants of the Blackwater money and surrounding himself with hired killers who owe him nothing but pay. It is a cruel pattern interrupt. The man who once mocked Dutch's speeches now imitates his worst delusions, convinced that with enough guns and enough cruelty, he can hold the world at bay. Up there, Micah becomes a paranoid mountain bandit, watching every trail, suspecting every ally, waiting for an inevitable reckoning he believes he can simply shoot his way through. But a story of this kind does not end in safety. That hoarded loot, that unfinished betrayal, and that lonely peak will draw one last visitor. Years later, when John Marston climbs that mountain, the ghosts of the Linde gang will finally come home, and the reckoning that began with Arthur's last breath will be finished in blood. When John finally reaches that lonely peak and leaves Dutch to his frozen surrender, it feels like an ending. In truth, it is only an intermission. The story of the Linde gang does not conclude with Arthur's grave or Dutch's disappearance. It coils forward into John Marston's second life, where the dream of freedom is twisted into a new kind of cage. In the years after Beaver Hollow, John, Abigail, and Jack attempt what many real outlaws once tried, to vanish into honest work and let the world forget their names. From its humble beginnings as a half-finished shack to a working homestead, Beecher's Hope is built board by board, fence post by fence post, in the truest sense a rejection of the gun. John breaks horses instead of bones, brands cattle instead of banks, and tries to teach Jack about books and stories rather than bullets and robbery. It echoes the real fates of men like Butch Cassidy's surviving associates or former members of the Doolin gang, who drifted into ranch work under aliases, hoping the telegraph lines and wanted posters would pass them by. But civilization does not forget. It keeps records. It files reports. It waits. The government's agents arrive at Beecher's Hope with ledgers in hand and rifles at their backs. Carrying a simple philosophy, the state holds all the cards. John's criminal past, Abigail's safety, Jack's future, these become bargaining chips. The message is clear. Hunt down the remnants of the Linde gang, or lose the fragile family that finally gave his life meaning. Freedom is replaced by conditional parole, enforced at gunpoint. This is not fantasy. It mirrors real cases where former outlaws became informants or reluctant lawmen, their loyalty bought or stolen by fear. Frank James testified to save himself. Former members of the Wild Bunch guided posses through country they once used as sanctuary, and more than one ex-robber rode as a deputy, tracking the very men who had once shared his campfire. The world was changing, and those who had lived outside the law were often dragged back in as tools, not citizens. For John, the irony is almost unbearable. Dutch had railed against government control, had claimed to be the living embodiment of resistance to a rigged civilization. Now John becomes the sharp end of that very system, sent to hunt Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and finally Dutch himself, the last survivors of a philosophy that once promised him purpose. Is there a deeper betrayal than being ordered to erase one's own past? In doing so, John becomes part of a larger American pattern, the state absorbing, weaponizing, and then discarding the last gunslingers of a vanished era. The old ways were dying, but they did not fade gently. They were conscripted, pointed, and fired one last time. What happens to the last outlaw when his only path to survival is to help kill the legend that made him? The answer, for John Marston, will be written in blood on the very land he tried to tame. For John Marston, that blood would lead back to a familiar ghost in the mountains. Years after Beaver Hollow and the collapse of the Linde dream, the trail of debts, whispers, and unfinished business finally converged on one name, Micah Bell, the man who had sold the gang to the Pinkertons. The last loose end of a story of loyalty and betrayal that had begun with such idealistic promises. The assault on Micah's hideout is not a grand cavalry charge. It is a hard, grinding climb. John and Sadie Adler fight their way up the snow-choked slopes of Mount Hagen, trading shots with Micah's new crew of cutthroats, men who have no idea they are guarding the grave of an entire world. The higher they climb, the more it feels in the truest sense like a return to the very beginning. Cold, hunger, and a gang on the run in the snow. Only this time, the gang is gone, and the dream is dead. Inside the ramshackle fortress, amid crates of stolen goods and the echo of gunfire, Sadie is taken, then freed, and John finally corners Micah. The two men who once rode under the same banner now face each other as pure enemies. Every shared memory twisted into a weapon. Their guns are drawn, their hatred absolute. And then the door opens, and the past steps in. Dutch van der Linde appears, older, thinner, eerily calm. His fine clothes have given way to a worn coat, his fiery sermons to a quiet, watchful silence. For a long moment, the three of them stand in a frozen triangle, the former leader, the traitor who replaced Arthur as favorite, and the son who escaped. No lawman could have staged a more cruel irony. The law does not have to corner this gang, it has already devoured itself. Words are few, but everything hangs in the air. Arthur's warnings, Hosea's doubts, Guarma, Saint Denis, Blackwater, Dutch's philosophy of freedom and family, now exposed as a scaffold for delusions and vanity. Micah rants and goads, John demands justice, and Dutch says almost nothing. What is there left to argue, when the bodies have already answered every question? Then Dutch moves. One shot, clean and weary, straight into Micah. It is not a heroic duel, not a roaring last stand. It is the living embodiment of a man finally admitting, without words, that Arthur was right and his own judgment was poisoned. In that instant, Dutch joins a long line of outlaw leaders who turned their guns inward when the pressure became unbearable. Gang chiefs who killed informants to settle scores, or sacrificed partners to appease the law and delay their own reckoning. The old ways were dying, and even the most stubborn captain of the old world could not escape the undertow forever. Yet even here, there is no simple redemption. Dutch lets John take the money, the last hoard from its humble beginnings in Blackwater, and walks away into the snow. He does not surrender. He does not apologize. He simply leaves, a lost soul severing himself from the family he created and destroyed in the same breath. Is this mercy, cowardice, or a final broken attempt at honor? The answer will not be found on that mountain. It will be written in Dutch's absence, in the choices John makes with that blood-stained fortune, and in the final hunt that still waits for him on a lonely ranch called Beecher's Hope. Beecher's Hope is where the blood money tries to become a future. With Dutch gone and Arthur's warnings echoing in his mind, John takes that fortune and does something no one in the gang ever managed. He attempts a quiet life, a ranch, a mortgage, a fence instead of a gun belt. From its humble beginnings as a half-built shack, Beecher's Hope becomes a fragile answer to a question the whole story has been asking. Can an outlaw ever truly buy redemption? John works that land with a desperation that borders on penance. He pays off debts, hires ranch hands, and signs his name on government papers that feel more binding than any set of shackles. Abigail and Jack return, and for a moment there's the living embodiment of Dutch's old philosophy, freedom, family, and self-reliance, stripped of speeches and robbery. Yet the world was changing. Telegraph wires, railroad tracks, and federal agents stretch across the horizon, a reminder that civilization does not forget its enemies, it files them. The government's demands never really end. John rides for Edgar Ross, hunts down former comrades, and delivers the last remnants of the van der Linde legacy to a state that wants the story finished, not understood. Each betrayal of the past buys another month of peace, another payment on the ranch, another night where Jack can read in bed instead of listening for gunfire. But this bargain has a price written in advance. From the very beginning, Ross never promised freedom. He promised an ending. That ending arrives on an ordinary morning. No grand robbery, no train exploding into the sky, just a barn, a family, and a sudden ring of federal rifles. When John steps inside to help Abigail with the horses, the trap closes. Agents surround the ranch with the cold efficiency of a ledger being balanced. There are no speeches, no offers of surrender, only the mechanical shuffle of boots and the rattle of guns being raised. Here, John makes his last choice. He shoves Abigail and Jack toward the back door, toward a sliver of freedom, and walks alone into the light. The barn doors open on a wall of rifles. For a heartbeat, he stands there, the last gunslinger in the truest sense, framed against the bright sky. Then he reaches for his revolver and is swallowed by gunfire. It is not a duel. It is a bureaucratic execution. In that moment, John joins the shadowed company of men like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, outlaws whose ends were less legend than paperwork and bullets. The old ways were dying, and the state did not need martyrs. It needed closure. John's death is the final bullet promised at the start of this saga, the point where the dreams and delusions of the van der Linde gang are buried under progress, reports, and forgotten graves. Or so it seems, until Jack Marston grows old enough to read the world's version of his father's story and decide how it should really end. Jack's story begins not with a gun in his hand, but with a book. A quiet boy in a noisy camp, he clung to tales of knights and explorers, to stories where honor meant something and violence had a purpose. While the gang argued over money and survival, Jack dreamed of authors and oceans. From its humble beginnings, his life seemed destined to escape the outlaw world that had raised him. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. The state that killed his father also taught Jack to read its version of events. In those dime novels and newspaper columns, John Marston became a name on a page, a cleaned-up cautionary tale, or a villain dispatched in the march of civilization. Jack, now a young man, carried both the memory of a quiet ranch and the echo of gunfire at Beecher's Hope. That tension, between family and legend, between justice and bureaucracy, cut deeper than any bullet. When Jack finally tracks down Edgar Ross, the agent who orchestrated John's death, it is not the wide-eyed child who walks along the riverbank in Mexico. It is a hardened, deliberate figure, the living embodiment of every lesson the van der Linde gang ever taught about loyalty, betrayal, and unfinished business. Ross is no cackling villain now, only a retired functionary hunting ducks, a man who has filed away the massacre of Beecher's Hope as just another completed assignment. Two men meet in the dust, one raised on heroic tales, the other sustained by reports and paychecks. Both reach for guns. Jack kills him. The moment is simple, almost quiet, and in the truest sense it is both justice and a crime. Does this bullet balance the scales, or does it only prove that the cycle cannot be broken? Jack, who once wanted to write stories, has instead stepped into one, trading ink for blood. It is a story of dreams and delusions, of a son who believed he could choose another path and discovers that inheritance is heavier than intention. History holds many echoes of this tragedy. Children of real outlaws in the American West often carried their parents' reputations like a brand. Some drifted into crime themselves, pulled toward the same easy money and hard endings. Others spent their lives protesting that they were not their fathers, even as sheriffs and Pinkertons watched them all the same. Whether the sons of the James brothers or lesser-known rustlers. They lived in the shadow of names turned into legend by dime novels that never mentioned empty cupboards or terrified nights. Jack stands at that same crossroads, a lost soul between lived experience and myth. His final act blurs the line between vengeance and righteousness, mirroring the messy reality behind every polished frontier legend. One day, perhaps, he will tell his family's story, or someone else will, reshaping their pain into the kind of legend that becomes entertainment. That is where the van der Linde saga truly passes into folklore, and where the outlaws who inspired it wait in the wings. From that moment where personal grief threatens to become entertainment, the story widens. The van der Linde saga stops being just a tale about a single gang and becomes a story of how outlaws are turned into symbols, then into products, then into myths that outlive the blood that birthed them. That process did not begin with cinema. In the late 19th century, dime novels and sensational newspapers seized on men like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, sanding down their cruelty and contradictions. Bank robbers who killed civilians became tragic patriots, rebels against railroads and banks, the living embodiment of a fantasy frontier where freedom mattered more than law. Later, Hollywood finished the job, staging clean duels at high noon instead of botched ambushes, loyal pauses instead of bickering crews, noble deaths instead of gangrenous endings. Rockstar understands that tradition and uses it. Dutch, Arthur, and John are written in the truest sense as mythic figures, but their roles are familiar. Dutch is the fallen king, a philosopher outlaw whose rhetoric grows more hollow as the world closes in. Arthur is the loyal knight, the disciplined right hand who doubts in private and bleeds in public. John is the last gunslinger, the man standing on the bridge between the old ways and the oncoming civilization, paying for sins he can never fully escape. Beneath those archetypes, there are clear historical echoes. Frank James, Jesse's older brother, was the steady, literate enforcer, a man who read newspapers about his own crimes and tried to manage the gang's image, Arthur's mix of discipline. Reflection and brutal efficiency comes from that mold. Bill Doolin led a band whose train robberies funded a roaming, makeshift family, much as Dutch's plans keep his camp alive. The camaraderie and staged photographs of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, posing in suits at studios before riding out to rob again, foreshadow Dutch gathering his people for portraits, determined to freeze the dream before it rots. Even the women carry history's fingerprints. Belle Starr's reputation as the bandit queen, moving between outlaw lovers and cultivating a legend larger than her actual crimes, hangs over Sadie Adler's transformation from grieving widow to relentless rider. Sadie is more competent than most legends gave women credit for, but the template is there, a lost soul who refuses the role civilization assigns. Here is the pattern interrupt. RDR2 indulges the outlaw myth even as it dissects it. The game lingers on campfires, songs, and stolen moments of freedom, inviting the romance that dime novels once sold. Then, it forces the player to watch tuberculosis eat Arthur alive, to see families displaced, towns terrorized, and loyalty shattered by betrayal and fear. Is this noble resistance, or organized selfishness wearing a poetic coat? The Van der Linde gang feels so real because it is built from the bones of actual history, rearranged into a single coherent tragedy. From its humble beginnings in backroom robberies to its final standoffs with Pinkertons, the gang stands at the crossroads where dreams and delusions collide, where the world was changing and the old ways were dying. The next step is to see how that changing world and those Pinkertons were just as real as the outlaws hunting for one last score. And that changing world is the real stage for the Van der Linde gang, because in the truest sense they are not just a band of criminals, but a failed experiment in building a just life outside a corrupt civilization. Dutch and Hosea dream of freedom without banks, railroads, or governments, a story of self-made justice and chosen families standing against an unfair system. But from the very beginning, that dream is paid for in blood. The gang's core tensions mirror the country around them, idealism versus reality, freedom versus civilization, family versus self-interest. Dutch talks about equality, about protecting the weak, about resisting the rich and powerful, yet his methods are robbery, intimidation, and murder. Hosea wants smaller scores, less violence, a life that might actually be sustainable. Arthur is the loyal lieutenant, enforcing Dutch's will even as his conscience grows louder. John pulls between his duty to this found family and his desire to be a husband and father. Each one is a different answer to the same question: how far should a person go in pursuit of freedom? In that sense, Dutch's camp is the living embodiment of a doomed utopia. It feeds the poor, shelters the broken, and preaches that no one owns the earth, yet it survives by taking from others at gunpoint. The gang denounces the railroads and oil barons, but depends on the very economy they claim to despise, robbing trains, banks, and corporate strongboxes. What chance did this fragile philosophy ever have, when it rested on violence, theft, and the ego of one charismatic outlaw, who could not admit he was wrong. Their tragedy echoes the broader American story. As the frontier closes, the same expansion that once promised opportunity hardens into corporate and federal control. The Dawes Act breaks tribal lands, railroads carve the continent, telegraphs and Pinkerton files erase anonymity. Outlaws such as Butch Cassidy, the Doolin Gang, and the James brothers face the same reality. The old ways were dying, and the new order has deeper pockets, better guns, and no patience for romantic bandits. Dutch is just one more man trying to outrun a machine that never gets tired. Yet within that broken world, decency still flickers. Arthur risks himself to help John escape, to save the Wapiti, to protect innocent townsfolk from the worst of Dutch's plans. Charles fights for a people already crushed by treaties and greed, then disappears to quietly build a life that harms no one. Their honor comes too late to save the camp, but not too late to matter. That is why this saga endures. Outlaw myths linger because they dramatize a secret fear that true freedom might demand more loss, more isolation, more violence than most hearts can bear. The Linde gang becomes a lens on that fear, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a family that tried to stand apart from the world and was swallowed by it. The next step is to see how the real outlaws of the American West carried the same fire, and how their lives quietly shaped Dutch, Arthur, and John. From the very beginning, this has been more than a tale of shootouts and stagecoaches. It has been a story of how an entire era of dreams and delusions was poured into one doomed campfire circle, and then handed to a player through a controller. From its humble beginnings in backroom card games and botched cons, the Linde gang grew into the living embodiment of a West that refused to die. Dutch and Hosea's first shared laugh over a failed robbery set the tone, two conmen trying to rob each other, then realizing they believed in the same performance. That moment of irony becomes the seed of a philosophy, a family, a roaming outlaw civilization. Arthur and John are pulled in as boys, raised under that fragile code, and the gang's rise through train jobs, town hits, and country hideouts mirrors the ascent of real bands led by men like Dutch Henry Bourne or Bill Doolin, who wrapped crime in rhetoric about freedom and fairness. The Blackwater disaster shatters that illusion, just as real ferry robberies and botched heists once shattered the myths around the James Younger gang. The Pinkertons close in, echoing the real Pinkerton National Detective Agency that stalked Jesse James and Butch Cassidy across a shrinking frontier. Each move from Coulter's frozen caves to Horseshoe Overlook, from Clemens Point to Shady Bell and finally Beaver Hollow, traces the same arc many real outlaws followed, pushed further to the margins as the world was changing, as the old ways were dying. Guarma, with its fever dream violence and colonial cruelty, becomes the grotesque detour, where Dutch's idealistic mask finally slips, just as some real philosopher outlaws turned from folk heroes into paranoid killers when pressed by railroads, telegraphs, and federal law. The collapse that follows, Micah's betrayal, the splintering of loyalty, and the Red Dead Redemption aftermath with John at Beecher's Hope, all echo those last, lonely years when surviving gunmen tried to become ranchers or laborers, haunted by the age they helped end. Seen through that lens, every major figure in the gang becomes a composite of real history. Arthur stands in for the loyal lieutenant, the Frank James or Bill Doolin enforcer, who keeps the machine running but pays the highest price. John carries the weight of the last generation of gunslingers, a man trapped between outlaw legend and domestic obligation, much like Butch Cassidy dreaming of Bolivia while the frontier closes behind him. Sadie's rampage channels women such as Belle Starr or the nameless widows who picked up rifles when no law would protect them. So what changes when familiar scenes are revisited with this in mind? Arthur's last ride down that sunlit hill is no longer just a scripted farewell. It becomes an elegy for every lost soul who tried to reconcile freedom with responsibility and failed. Sadie storming through gang hideouts turns into a furious answer to a history that often erased women's rage. John mending fences and breaking horses at the ranch is no simple epilogue, but a mirror of countless former outlaws who traded revolvers for plows and discovered that civilization could be just as merciless. Understanding these inspirations does not drain the magic from the story. In the truest sense, it deepens it. Each emotional beat is grounded in real blood, real compromises, real bodies left in canyons and unmarked graves. The cost of Dutch's philosophy is no longer theoretical, because history shows what happens when rhetoric runs into railroads and repeaters. The next time the gang rides out under a bruised sky, it is not just a fictional posse on a mission marker. It is a myth built from a century of American dreams and nightmares, a story of loyalty and betrayal replayed with every pull of the trigger and every quiet moment by the fire, waiting for dawn and the next bad decision. So where does the trail lead once the last shot has echoed and the campfires have burned down to ash? The story of the Van der Linde gang does not end with credits on a screen. It lingers in the quiet corners of Red Dead Redemption 2, in the half-heard conversations, the discarded letters, the missions that seemed simple until the truth behind them became clear. From its humble beginnings in the snow at Coulter to the humid nights at Shady Bell and the choking air of Beaver Hollow, every camp is a museum of foreshadowing. A return to those story missions and side paths becomes a different journey once the real history is known. A throwaway joke about Pinkertons turns into a nod toward the actual agency that hunted Jesse James. A tense train robbery starts to echo the James Younger gang and the Doolin Dalton boys. A quiet exchange between Arthur and Hosea suddenly reads as an elegy for a philosophy that civilization has already sentenced to death. In the truest sense, the game becomes a layered archive, one story on the surface, a dozen older stories buried underneath. A late-night talk with Charles about the world changing for his people, an argument between Abigail and John over what freedom really costs, a bitter rant from Micah about loyalty and betrayal, all of it begins to mirror the headlines and dime novels of the 1890s. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and each mission marker is another attempt to outrun that simple fact. Beyond this chapter, there are deeper trails to ride. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency that dogs Dutch's gang carried out real manhunts against the James brothers, the Wild Bunch, and dozens of nameless drifters. Its case files tell a story of relentless progress, grinding down every outlaw dream. The women of the gang point toward their own buried canon, Belle Starr, the so-called Bandit Queen, or the sharpshooting performers who blurred the line between spectacle and survival. A character-by-character breakdown can trace Dutch to the philosopher-outlaw archetype, Arthur to enforcers like Frank James, John to last-generation gunmen staring down a future of telegraphs and barbed wire. So a question hangs in the dust. Which member of the gang now feels different? Which connection to a real outlaw, a real case, a real massacre on a nameless main street struck hardest? Another might see Micah not just as a villain, but as the living embodiment of every turncoat who traded a campfire family for a Pinkerton paycheck. Another might hear Sadie speak and think of the women whose names never made it into the history books at all. This has been only one chapter in a larger exploration of how games remember. Red Dead Redemption 2 preserves, distorts, and reimagines history, turning criminals into tragic figures and lawmen into distant silhouettes, just as dime novels and Hollywood once did. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, retold for a new generation that meets the frontier through pixels instead of dust. Picture, then, a lone rider on a fading trail. No gang, no grand plan, only hoofbeats and the low hum of a coming storm. The horizon swallows horse and rider, as it has swallowed every real outlaw whose name has already been forgotten. Yet the questions they raise still ride beside that silhouette. What is freedom? What is family? What price does civilization demand? The old ways were dying, but the stories refused to go quiet. Ride on, and let the next tale begin where this one disappears into the light.